Hey everybody, it's Lavender Town, and today we're going to be talking about the terrifying, dark, and sometimes real origins of Disney's most popular princess movies. And I thought it would make a lot of sense to start with Snow White, as she was the very first Disney princess we ever saw on the silver screen. Now, many people think that the original story of Snow White was in Grimm's fairy tales, but in reality the Grimm's brothers didn't actually write any fairy tales themselves. They mostly collected them from oral tradition and adapted them for print. So what is the origin of the Snow White tale? Well, according to a German historian named Eckhard Sander, in 1533, 16-year-old Margaretha von Waldeck was forced out of her home to Brussels by her stepmother, where she fell in love with a prince who would become Philip II of Spain. Already, you might be able to sense that there's some similarities between Snow White and this girl. Unfortunately, that's not where the similarities end. Margaretha died at age 21, likely due to poisoning. She suddenly fell ill, had tremors in her hands that you could see in the handwriting of her last will and testament. So who could have done this? Well, unlike in the Disney movies, it's a pretty big deal to carry on a romance with a prince. It's said that the King of Spain may have dispatched Spanish agents to murder her. And lastly, what of the mining dwarves in Snow White? Well, Margaretha's father owned copper mines, and almost everyone who worked them was either a child or had horrific stunted growth because of their terrible childhood full of labor. Now, I'm going to be basing the direct comparison Snow White to the Grimm's fairy tale version more because I don't have a detailed description of what Margaretha looked like. So all I have to go on is the Grimm's fairy tale, the oldest version I could find. So what I did was I made her significantly younger looking. I tried to mimic Disney's signature style, but I made sure that she looked more like a 7-year-old versus a 14-year-old. And I also kept her hair relatively long and gave her a band in her hair because that was more in fashion back in the day. I also put a bodice on her because there is a part in the story where the evil queen brings her a lacy and colorful bodice and then strings it up too tight, so tightly that she almost suffocates before the dwarves find her and rescue her. I also used freshly fallen snow as an eyedropper sample for her skin and ebony as an eyedropper sample for her hair so that her skin would be like freshly fallen snow and her hair would be black like ebony. Lastly, I muted the colors so they looked more possible and natural for the time. Next up is Cinderella, and Cinderella has so many versions it's actually hard to track them all down. There's the Brothers Grimm version, which was very dark and edgy with the stepsisters cutting off their toes to try to fit into the tiny shoe. There's Cendrillon, a French version that is very similar to the Disney version and that invented the fairy godmother and the pumpkin transformation. There's the Vietnamese version, Tam and Cam, which involves a young girl whose kindness to a fish allows her to go to the ball. And there's also a Chinese version that's very similar to that one as well. But the oldest one that anyone has been able to find was written in the year 7 BC, and it was written about a real woman named Rhodopis. Now, this is a Grecian story and a Grecian woman, though some say that she was from Thrace, which is near Greece but not exactly in it. Rhodopis was literally a slave. She wasn't just made to do housework by mean relatives, she actually belonged to someone, like she was a piece of property. And this is about as low as you could go for an origin. Now, she was a hetaira, or a hetare, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce this word, but basically it was kind of like an escort. She was kept around at parties to be charming and to hang out with creepy Greek guys, and basically it was her whole life ever since she was a child. Now, the tale goes that while she was bathing, a eagle came down and took one of her sandals and dropped it in the lap of the king of Egypt, who saw it as an act of the gods and decided that he had to find out whose foot was once in this sandal so that he could marry her. Now, obviously this story is not true. That would be a very long way for an eagle to go from Greece to Egypt, and besides, it's just pretty crazy. But There is actually quite a bit of truth to this if you take this story and relate it to Rhodopis herself. Now, like I said, she was a slave, so she had no rights whatsoever, but when she traveled to Egypt, she actually did have someone fall so deeply in love with her that he ransomed off the cost of her slavery so she could be a free woman. And after that point, she actually became very wealthy and was able to live as a free person, which is quite a wonderful Cinderella story, I think. So in order to make this more origin-based Cinderella design, I had to make her both Greek and Egyptian. I had to have her sort of origin and the look of herself to be very Greek, and then I had to have the princess version of herself look very Egyptian, because in the original Cinderella story, she became an Egyptian queen. I was originally going to design the Egyptian elements of her based on Nefertiti, who was a full-on Egyptian female pharaoh, but because in the story she is in the Egyptian royal family by marriage, she would actually be a great royal wife, so I instead based her adornments around Binanath. I don't know if that's right either. Very difficult to pronounce names in this episode, but she was a great royal wife of Ramses and also his firstborn daughter, which is yeah, I based the headdress around that. So then I just tried to color her based on what I assumed she probably would have looked like. I tried to look up images of Rhodopis, but she is mostly drawn by and painted by Romans, who typically tend to Romanize everything that they ever paint, and it's very hard to tell what she might have actually looked like based on the Roman idea of it, because again, she was from well before their time. So now I wanted to take her in and again do a full Disney style princess design of her. So Disney does tend to simplify things so that they can animate a little better, so I tried to limit the rather luxurious styles of Egypt so that we can more easily imagine her being animated as a Disney princess. I also didn't want to lose everything about her that's Greek, so I still tried to base the dress type thing she's wearing roughly around Greece. And again, because I didn't want to rely on Roman paintings for reference, I tried to use etchings and sculptures that were actually from ancient Greece. I kept this little transparent sort of shawl that she had around her shoulders because very well-off Egyptian women would show off their wealth and prosperity by having extremely fine linens that would actually be transparent because they are so fine. So I kept that element of her adornment. I think it's safe to assume that she probably had dark hair and eyes and a darker complexion than our version of Cinderella that we're used to, just because she is from Greece, and if she is in Egypt, she's probably also getting a pretty sick tan from all the sun that she would be dealing with. I also noticed that Grecian women, when they were shown as beautiful in Grecian art, typically had a very strong brow, not unlike the trends of 2017 and 2016. So I gave her a nice strong brow for that as well. And in order to make it look more like Disney, I also colorized the line art after I was done with the rest of the shading and coloring, because as you can see in this Cinderella reference picture, they tend to do that. And with that, she is done. She ended up looking really different from the original Cinderella, but I kind of like it. It's pretty cool to have a Greek-Egyptian style story, and I never would have suspected that that's where the origins of Cinderella came from. Now, this next one doesn't have a true story inspiration, which might not surprise you because this is The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. The features I could pull out of the story that I know for sure that she has is a rosy mouth, long waving hair. When she was in her mermaid form, she had 8 oysters clipped to her tail very painfully to show her status, and a wreath of white lilies in her hair that each had a half pearl in them. We also know that she's 15 years old and that she is very pale because they keep referring to her hands being white. Now let's talk about the plot differences between the original and the Disney version. Little Mermaid is a story about a 15-year-old girl mermaid who sees the surface for the first time and decides she wants to be a part of it. So she gives up her ability to speak for a pair of legs so she can try to gain the love of a prince that she sees walking around in the land. Now this all sounds very similar to the Disney story, I'm sure, but the main differences are that this story is just way more messed up and there is no happy ending. First of all, the sea witch that she approaches demands her voice, but she actually demands to cut out the Little Mermaid's tongue, like physically remove it. So she doesn't just lose her voice by being a little magic orb like in the movie, but she actually gets her tongue cut out, which is pretty horrific. Then, in addition to that, every time she steps with her new legs, it's agonizingly painful. Every time she sets any weight on her feet, it feels like needles or knives stabbing into her feet. All the while, she's pretending it's not bothering her because she wants the love of the prince so badly. And she knows that if she gains his love, she'll be able to live forever and be with him forever. But if she doesn't, she's going to turn into sea foam and die. So the stakes are very high for this one, and unfortunately, it just does not go her way. He ends up having a misunderstanding about who saved him from drowning. She was the one who actually did, but instead he thinks it's someone else, and he decides to marry her instead after carrying on a romance with the Little Mermaid for quite a while. And she has an opportunity to save herself. All of her sisters cut off their hair so that she would have an opportunity to not die and turn into sea foam, and all that she would have to do is plunge a knife into the heart of the prince. But she cannot do it in the end, and she throws herself off the side of the boat, turning to sea foam and basically disappearing. Now, the good part is, at the very end, she discovers that in her act of selflessness, she is allowed to become an air nymph, which is basically kind of like a purgatory where she watches over the prince and his new bride, and she can sort of exist as kind of like a ghost. And there's even an opportunity that maybe in the future she might be able to come back to life. But as it is, by the end of the story, it's pretty bittersweet, and it's a pretty rough tale. I hope your guys' childhoods weren't too ruined by this video and that you enjoyed all the information and the stories about these crazy dark origins. Let me know if you have any ideas for videos you want me to make in the future, and I will see you guys next week. Big thank you to my patrons, including Scott Peterson, Christy Stewart, Payne Hamill, The Artsy Moose, Elizabeth Albin, Cal Popone, Cameo Sparkle, Hanuki, Zixith, Ollie, Neko-sama, Hope Chilsum, Abriana, Trasso Maniac, Micah Dactyl Okamore, Matthew Kunke, Blep, Sergeant Pendulum, Lena Christine, Baba Green, Taka, Lovely, Mystic, Enzo Jobert, Your Boy ST, JJ Jade, Lib Lib Lib, and Addy Visual.